In this video, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to serialism. First of all, to give you a starting point for analysing serial music by composers like Schoenberg, Webern and Bach, and also so that you've got some idea as to how to write your own music using this compositional technique. I am going to return in a bit to why composers wanted to use serial techniques to write their music, but I think a more helpful starting point is just to make sure, first of all, that we really understand what we mean by serialism. What you can see on screen in front of you is all the notes of the chromatic scale, so all 12 of the possible notes that are available to a Western composer who's using the notes available on the piano. And as you'll see, it's not just in the order it would be in a chromatic scale, but the composer, in this case Webern, has chosen an order. So he started on C sharp, and then he's gone up to E, and then he's continued choosing notes without repeating them until he's used all 12 notes up. And it's this series of notes that is used then as the basis for the whole piece, and that's why it's called serial composition, because it's based on this series. It's sometimes called a tone row or a note row, or a 12 note row as well. So choosing a row is something that a serial composer does before they start the business of actually writing their piece, and there's quite a lot more of this pre-compositional work to do before you actually get going. So the next thing you do is you take your row or your series, which I've now put in the top left hand quadrant of this example, and then you transform it in various ways into different but related rows. So as you can see, to the right hand side in the right hand quadrant is a retrograde, which is simply the row backwards. Rather than starting on C sharp and going to the G, you start on the G and go backwards along the row to the C sharp. So that gives a different form of the row, a different chromatic melody, if you like. So going back to the prime form of the row, or the original form of the row, another transformation that you can make is to invert it, create an inversion of the row. So if retrogrades involve a sort of vertical mirror, it's a reflection of the row from the back to the front, the inversion is like a mirror put underneath the row, so you get a mirror version of the row below. So you can see, as I've shown with the arrows and semitone counts, that whereas the prime, the original form of the row, goes up 3 semitones, C sharp to E, the inversion below it goes down 3 semitones from C sharp to A sharp, and then the prime goes up 1 semitone to F, so the inversion goes down 1 semitone to A, and so on. So you get a mirrored version or an inversion of the prime form of the row. So that gives you now 3 different chromatic melodies, all of which use all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. And then finally, in the bottom right hand quadrant, you do both operations at once. So you both turn it upside down and you turn it backwards to get what's called a retrograde inversion, or a backwards mirror form of the row. So we've now got 4 versions of this prime, including the original, that we can use for our composition. But composers also do a final type of operation in order to give themselves a little bit more material, and that is that each of these 4 versions of the row can be transposed, and because it's chromatic, it can be transposed in fact 12 times. So I've shown in this slide here the first 4 transpositions of the prime and retrograde versions of the row. So we call the first one P1, sometimes it's called P0, and then upper semitone starting on D instead of C sharp with exactly the same intervals, we have P2, and then P3, another semitone up, and then P4, another semitone up, etc. And you can see the retrogrades do the same. And you can carry on doing that until you've got back to the beginning, which gives you 12 transpositions in total, including the original. And of course, you can also do the same to the inversion and the retrograde inversion. Moving away from staff notation, from musical notation, you can show all the possibilities quite neatly on what is sometimes called a serial matrix. So here you can see all 48 possible derivations of the original row. And you read the table by going in whatever direction you're interested in. So P1, and starting in the top left-hand corner, you read from the top left along horizontally, so C sharp, E, F, and you read the retrograde of that row R1 starting on the right hand side of the top row of the table and going back. Similarly, the inversions are read down the table, so starting in the top left hand corner and going down the first column, C sharp, B flat, A, etc. And you read the retrograde inversions going back up the same way. Now you may notice that both the primes and the inversions, and of course all the retrogrades as well, are written in a rather curious order. So it goes 1, 10, 9, 0, etc. rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the reason for that is that it allows us to put all of the different possibilities on one single grid. So if you write down the first note of the prime following the inversion, so you start with P1, which starts on C sharp, but then rather than P2, you put the one that starts on B flat. That allows you then to fit all the inversions on the table going down. So there's no theoretical significance to these orderings. It just makes it handily possible to fit the whole thing on a single grid. So we can read any of the possible 48 permutations of this particular row form off this one table by either going along or back or down or up, depending on what version of the row we want. So before we look at how Webern actually uses this material in a composition, it's worth just very briefly thinking about why he might choose to do so. I've talked in another video in the introduction to the 20th century about the three composers who were the early pioneers of this technique. And before they started writing serial music, they were what was known as expressionists. So they wrote music that was very chromatic and dissonant and angular and dramatic, and they used that music to portray, on the whole, highly emotional texts or ideas. And the music was kind of very overwrought, and you can't really continue writing in that highly emotional style as your only register as a composer. It might be that you want to write music that does other things too. So I think that's one of the problems that this serial technique is attempting to address, to give composers a way of using dissonance and chromaticism in a way that becomes a fundamental part of a coherent musical language, like the major-minor system that tonal composers used before 1900. And then you can carry on, as Schoenberg once said, composing as before. In other words, your language is now a different one, a much more dissonant and chromatic one, but you can still compose theme and variations and concerti and such things, rather than just composing highly emotional works like Schoenberg's famous Violin, which I discussed in the 20th century video. Composers had experimented with moving away from being in a key before the end of the 19th century. So an early example is this Liszt piece, the famous piano virtuoso, and he called this little piano work Bagatelle sans tonalité, bagatelle without tonality. And you can see what he means by without tonality. It doesn't end on a clear major or minor chords, and perhaps even more importantly, the music is so very chromatic that it's impossible really to distinguish a clear hierarchy, a sense that we are using a particular scale. We're just using most of the notes of the chromatic scale most of the time. Let's just listen to the ending of this Liszt bagatelle. One measure of how chromatic this piece is, and it is indeed very chromatic, is by looking at the notes and seeing how long it takes to use up all the notes of the chromatic scale. So you can see just in the first 2 bars of this little extract, Liszt uses up all 12 notes. The red notes represent repeats of notes we've already heard. So in fact he's used 9 of the notes by the end of the first bar, and then uses D, which we haven't had before, at the beginning of bar 178, and then he repeats some notes before we get the final 2 notes at the end of the bar. Now this piece for Liszt represents something of an experiment, and it disappears at the end in this sort of fog of chromaticism. But Schoenberg, who wants to create a whole musical language with this sort of level of chromaticism and with the same lack of tonality that we see in the Liszt, if not more, wants to come up with something that is more systematic. And that is what the serial method is for. It's a way of formalizing music that isn't based on major or minor scales, that actively avoids using major or minor scales and actively avoids making some notes more important than others. So it's interesting to compare a piece by one of his pupils, Webern. This is from the middle of the piece based on the row that I showed you at the beginning, and you can see that he uses up the notes much more efficiently, if you like. So there's only a couple of repetitions before we've used up all 12 notes of the chromatic scale, because of course he's using this serial technique that Schoenberg has developed. So if the Liszt tends to avoid a sense of harmony and tonality, this Webern piece absolutely obliterated, as you can hear. It's incredibly chromatic. It's about as chromatic as it's possible to be. It's incredibly dissonant and a very sort of spiky texture. And it's by using the row that allows Webern and Schoenberg and Berg to write music that avoids tonality in such a strong way. Well, not just avoids it, but really totally throws it out of the window, in this case at least. So in essence, what Schoenberg and his pupils are trying to do is they're trying to find a new harmonic system, a new harmonic tonal system, a new language within which to write music that replaces the tonal system. And then they can make the same choices that any composer has as to what to do about textures and rhythms and melodies and all that sort of stuff. But it's a way of providing a new starting point in terms of how the pitches of the music are organized. And that's what serialism basically is. So let's have a little look at Webern's quartet that we've just heard a little snippet of, and that I showed you the row for at the beginning of this video. Now, Webern is probably the most hardcore serial composer, if you like, of the 3 composers that we're looking at, and the most strict and the most uncompromising, which is why he's a good place to start. And his music can be a little bit tricky to get your ears round and your head round and to really sort of find enjoyable. But you have to adjust the way you listen to the music, and actually the tight construction of it in the very sparse and economical way in which Webern writes. If you can sort of find a way of appreciating that, the music is actually in its own way, very beautiful. So looking back at the matrix that we constructed with all these inversions and retrogrades and retrograde inversions, the first two forms of the row that Webern uses are P11 in the middle of the table there, or towards the middle of it, B, D, D sharp, C, etc. And I1, which is the one going down the far left-hand column. So here you can see those two rows being used. So the I1 is shown in red boxes connected by lines and P11 by blue boxes. You can see that Webern has used this in a very unusual way, not at all like you'd use the melodic material in a traditional classical piece. The music's so fragmented, in fact, that it's almost like just little points of sound dotted between the instruments, and that's why this type of texture is sometimes called pointillistic, because you've got just these little points coming out of the texture. But although and because the music is fragmented in this way, it sounds almost quite chaotic if you don't know what you're listening for. Actually, it's very highly organized, necessarily because it's based on the tone rows, but also because of what Webern chooses to do with them. So he takes an inversion and a prime, and he writes what's called a mirror canon. So I1 kicks off, and then P11 comes in a little bit later, effectively imitating it, but in inversion. We've got the inversion first, and then the original form of the row. So we've got this sort of canon, but with the two parts mirroring each other. And if you're an expert listener and you know what you're listening for, you can almost hear, or you can hear, this mirroring effect. You can hear the tenor saxophone with a very steep downward melodic trajectory, and then countered by the violin's very steep upward one, and then you get those two sets of three semiquavers in the piano, one a very clear downward and then upward shape, and the other up then down. So the structures that Webern is writing, partly because the music is so sparse and fragmented, are actually relatively easy to hear if you know that they're there. So that's the introduction, in fact, to Webern's Quartet Opus 22. That's the piece this is, for violin, clarinet, tenor saxophone and piano. And in a good example of the very tight construction that Webern goes for in this piece, the last part of the movement, the coda, is exactly the same pitch material as this introduction, but all played in reverse. So the piece is bookended by this introduction in which the material is presented forwards, and then the piece is capped off at the end by the same material being played backwards. So this shows the whole movement summarized. It's very short, like virtually all of Webern's music, and it's in a kind of sonata form, in that the music introduces its main material in the bit we've just seen, where we have the prime form of the row and its inversion in the mirror canon, and then we get a slightly more formal exposition of the material, as we'll see in a second. And then there's a development in the sense that it uses different row forms from that used in the exposition. And then a recapitulation, again in the sense that it uses the same row forms as the exposition. So it's kind of bringing back those ideas, just like a recapitulation in a classical sonata form. And then there's a coda tacked on the end. So I think it would be pretty amazing if you heard that form on a first listening, but it does sort of show how the piece is constructed. So this is the beginning of the exposition, and you can see that Webern has added a new element compared to the introduction. There's still a mirror canon. You can see that in green and blue, skipping between the piano there at the bottom and the clarinet and violin at the top. But in the middle, marked out in red, the saxophone plays the prime form of the row, almost like a melody accompanied by that mirror canon weaving around it. Quite hard to hear it like that without making a special effort, but that is very much how the music's constructed. There's an interesting contrast between the same material as it is presented in the recapitulation. I've shown the melody in each case in red here and the accompaniment in blue. The melody is a single line, whereas the accompaniment is a mirror canon in both cases. But you can see in the exposition that we've just heard, the melody is presented on one instrument, just on the saxophone, and the mirror canon weaves between the other instruments. But in the recapitulation, Webern reverses this so that you get all of the mirror canon happening in the piano part, in the blue box, and the melody itself passes between the melodic instruments. The changes of colour that this produces as the melody moves from one instrument to another has a fancy German name, Klangfarben melody, which means colour melody. So you get this sense of the colour of the tune changing as it moves in pairs and threes of notes between the instruments. So that gives you a sense of how this Webern quartet is put together. It's a piece with at least a nominally traditional structure, this sonata form idea, harmony and tonality that is totally removed from the major minor tonal system, highly chromatic, highly dissonant, based very strictly on this serial technique. And obviously everything really follows from that as well. The melody is necessarily also very chromatic, and Webern chooses a row that makes it also quite angular. And then with the other aspects of the music, Webern is also deliberately making it quite untraditional in terms of its melody and its texture, and even the choice of instruments in the first place. So having got a sense from the most extreme early serialist how this music is put together, we're just going to very briefly look at a snippet by Schoenberg, who was Webern's teacher, and Bach, who was his fellow pupil, both of whom composed perhaps in a rather more traditional style compared to the very avant-garde feel to Webern's music. So let's have a little look first at a piece by Schoenberg, who taught both of the other two. And this is from his Variations for Orchestra, written in the late 1920s. And you can see immediately, before we've even listened to it, that it has a slightly more traditional feel than the Webern. The melody is presented in the cello, the second line from the bottom there, and it's a more normal melody perhaps than the Webern, perhaps more traditionally expressive, and it's accompanied by a sort of chordal accompaniment. And in fact, the cello melody is based on the prime form of the row, and the chords that accompany it in a technique that a lot of serial composers use are made up from segments from the row. So the first chord is made up from the first 6 notes of the row, I9, and the second chord is made up from the second 6 notes, or hexachord. So perhaps a more traditional sense of melody and texture compared to the very angular and spiky and fragmented Webern that we heard before. But don't be fooled, this is music that is just as tightly constructed from a serial point of view, and in fact Schoenberg uses an interesting feature here, because if you look at the row forms that he uses, P0, the prime form of the row, and the 9th inversion of the row, I9, the first half of each row together, so in other words the first half of P0 and the first half of I9, make up a full chromatic set. So what that means is that by the time we get to halfway through the melody plus that chord above it is all the notes of the chromatic scale, and the same thing in the second half of the melody. So Schoenberg is very carefully choosing his rows to make the music even more maximally chromatic. And in fact, that feature of the rows is sometimes known as combinatoriality because of the way that they combine to form a full chromatic set. So we're going to finish off by listening to just a little snippet from a piece by Alban Berg, Schoenberg's other pupil, and this is from his violin concerto. Now, if Webern took Schoenberg's method and used it in an incredibly strict and uncompromising way, Berg tended in the other direction. He found ways of making the music that he based on the serial technique expressive and sort of softer edged than anything that Webern wrote, and indeed than much that Schoenberg wrote as well. His violin concerto is a very good example of this, and you can see one of the reasons why it comes across as much more soft edged by looking at the row itself, which is at the top of the slide there. So you can see it's made up of a G minor triad, G, B flat, D, and then starting on that D that we've just got to, D, F sharp, A makes a D major triad, which is in fact the dominant of G minor, and then there's an A minor chord and an E major chord in a similar relationship carrying on up, and then the final 3 notes of the row are a little bit more chromatic. They are basically a whole tone scale. So when the violin introduces the row, it sounds like this. So although it sounds by no means tonal or very sort of traditional in its harmony tonality, it's much softer around the edges because of these choices that Berg has made with his row. And he's so interested in this sort of connection between tonality and serialism that he actually incorporates the Bach chorale at the bottom of the screen there into the work. Interestingly, the last 4 notes of the tone row at the top there, which form a whole tone scale, are also the first 4 notes of the Bach chorale. So Webern's making a connection there between his atonal, essentially, row and the obviously tonal, if quite odd, Bach chorale. Very unusual to start with that melody, and the harmonisation of it's very unusual. You can hear both things coming together here towards the end of the violin concerto, where you get both the chorale played in the wind and brass and the serial stuff weaving around it. So one technique, serialism, and three very different pieces. And that's the thing about serialism, that in the end all it does is provide some pitch materials, and you can control what sort of pitch materials those are to some extent by the way in which you choose your row, and then you can choose how the music comes out. But it sort of releases a composer from the responsibility of having to worry about his harmonic material. And I think for Schoenberg and Webern and Berg, it meant that they felt that they could be like composers before the 20th century, who similarly didn't have to worry about the fundamentals of their language. Of course, they had to worry about how to use tonality and how to compose their pieces, but they didn't have to continually be reinventing the very basis of where their pitches came from. And I think that's what serialism offered and still can offer to composers, a way of generating pitch material that can then be used to compose in whatever way that you like.